and welcome to UC Today. My name is Kieran Devlin, and today's session will address why digital sovereignty is rapidly becoming not only a political talking point, but a commercial deal breaker, and how business leaders who ignore the shift are potentially exposing themselves to massive strategic risk. I am delighted to be joined by Jean-Marc Chanoine, Chief Sales Officer at Templafy. Jean-Marc, thanks for joining us.
Yeah, it's a pleasure being here. Extremely honored to have the opportunity to speak with you today.
Before we explore the nitty-gritty of digital sovereignty, can you please tell us a little about yourself, Jean-Marc, and your Templafy journey?
My Templafy journey started about 7 years ago. I was working at Accenture Strategy. I was tasked with finding software to do some document automation, and I bumped to it online and made a decision 7 years ago to email the CEO, Jesper, and he decided to let me join as an account executive. And, 7 long years later, I'm currently the chief sales officer. And when we think about Templafy, what we provide the document agent. And what a document agent does is ultimately allow organizations via prompt to presentation to create essentially business content. And what do we mean by business content? It's the content that has to be correct. It's the reports, it's the proposals, it's the pitch decks. And what we've seen within the market has been that organizations need speed, but ultimately they need accuracy. And so one of the things we do when organizations have, ultimately run out of options with some of the big providers, we say, great. With Templafy, we're able to deliver those outputs with very little human intervention and also solve a big business problem. I think some of the biggest observations we've had is that at the end of every business process, there tends to be a document, right? If you're selling to a customer, there's a proposal. If you're a lawyer, there's a contract. If there's a financial performance, there's a report. So nearly every single business process ultimately results in a document being created. So if we think about how much work and how much time people spend, about 43% of time is spent creating content on the back of some type of business process. And what we're doing is we're delivering essentially a 30% time savings in that arena, freeing up individuals within their organization to basically do other work. So organizations such as, KPMG, BDO, they leverage Templafy on a day-to-day basis because their core goal is to eliminate manual document work. And really for us, Templafy document agents are in essence designed to provide that speed and accuracy that no other solution right now provides.
Perfect. Well, I think it's a real breadth of experience that positions you nicely for today's conversation, Jean-Marc. And when we were planning this call, you noted that even US-friendly governments are now rejecting solutions reliant on US-based LLMs. Historically, opting for domestic tech over Silicon Valley giants often meant accepting a trade-off in performance or features. Are we now reaching a tipping point where the sovereignty risk of US dependence now outweighs the capability gap of local models, or are European enterprises effectively accepting that performance task to buy political independence?
I think the way to think about it is if you're betting your entire strategy on a single AI provider in the short term for short-term convenience, I think ultimately that results in some risk, right? And I think one of the key things to think about is AI in of itself just allows for the easier creation of new technology. So really, when we're thinking about this era of uncontested US dominance, I think what's key to note is that there's more competition, right? There's models that are originating out of the EU, out of Canada, out of the US, out of China. And I think the back in the day, when you think about it, it was clear who the winner was going to be. And I think in today's world, what we're running into is that there's great performance happening across the globe. And really the two key factors is compute and cache. And so when those two factors exist, it leads to a scenario where you can actually deliver technology and software from a local perspective that works. I think one of the big things that we're seeing is that, CIOs and organizational leaders and sovereign leaders, they're not just asking anymore, okay, what's the best model? What's the best local model? And also one thing to start taking into consideration, there's language components, there's data components, and really when we're thinking about technology, I think it's expanded to a world now where it's an important question being asked. And it's a question that, prior, I'd say the 6 years prior, I hadn't really heard before until recently, which is as a CIO, as a government, you're starting to think about, okay, great, how do we ultimately buy local? And as Templafy, one of the key things that we've really thought about is how do you be model agnostic? Like, how do you deliver the service on your application in this scenario without necessarily relying on a distinct model? And I think one of the key things to think about is who's going to be the winner, right? Because you're building infrastructure for the years and decades to come. How do you ultimately deliver the results that you want when everything every 6 months is changing so rapidly?
And I think that's a very elegant segue into my next question, because when you are discussing these winners, you talk about companies that are building these model agnostic systems. However, in practice, how feasible is true agnosticism when the underlying architectures and models from OpenAI, Mistral, others differ so wildly? Are you seeing enterprises and their CIOs, CISOs actually swap models dynamically based on region? Or is agnosticism, I guess, a form of a safety valve they buy but find it difficult to use?
Well, let's break it down to build versus buy. I think the very first question that organizations ask is, are they going to build their applications on top of a AI model provider, or are they going to buy essentially third-party applications to solve their problems? Now, the reason that's important is the infrastructure that you talk about really impacts build a bit more than buy. And here's what I mean. So for example, at Templafy, one of the key things we've seen, like we work with some of the largest organizations in the world and we do document automation, right? And let's say we're talking about contracts, proposals, pitch decks, reports, and those components. Now, what we've seen within organizations is that they actually today leverage multiple models, right? So it may be a case where an organization's leveraging OpenAI and Anthropic and DeepSeek all at the same time, depending on what part of the business is operating and the specific use case and cost, as a matter of fact. So yes, you're right. There is unique infrastructure that may need to be built, again, especially in the build scenario. But what we're seeing is that it's almost mandatory that you be able to connect multiple models. I mean, one example for us, we're working with one of the big four, and we're automating some of their core SEC required reports. Even within that single report, there's multiple models trained on multiple different sets of data and RAG, where all of that needs to go into a single document. And if we weren't able to address the multiple model case, we wouldn't be able to operate. And so I think it's more about, if you look ahead, what we're going to see is that it's going to get cheaper and cheaper to deliver essentially core AI. So what's extremely important is that organizations start really thinking about, okay, what is my core infrastructure? And so you might have a scenario where in Germany, there's a specific requirement. In France, there's a different requirement. In the US, there's a different requirement. And so, but you don't want to have to buy distinct applications to be able to address that. You want to be able to use the same application, plug it into essentially the right AI to deliver an output. And so one example of it, you might have a, France sales team requesting Mistral, and then you have a US sales team essentially leveraging OpenAI to automate their go-to-market content. But that doesn't mean the application needs to change. It's simply that the model in that particular scenario, the model selection component, is chosen deliberately in order to meet essentially local rules or requirements.
No, I think that's a really astute point, and I think that kind of complexity, as you say, as it becomes more cheaper and more simplified. This is where the multimodal aspect really comes into its own. And moving on to, I guess, an entirely different part of it, but also using your extensive experience. As a former Navy JAG, you understand the importance and the dominance of the US better than most in the tech market. From your perspective, are there any long-term implications for how international markets develop their own AI capabilities to compete with US vendors abroad?
I can say very clearly that the era of uncontested U.S. tech dominance is being challenged. today, and there's multiple reasons why. I think the biggest one is ultimately that software is easier to create than it's ever been before because of AI. So it's almost a self-fulfilling prophecy where you have essentially organizations, or if you take Anthropic, they're claiming most of their code, not all their code, is being generated by AI. And if you look at a lot of the big applications that are used within enterprises or governments, there's a big question. If you can develop it locally at lower costs and it's just as effective, is that not a great strategy? And that's always been a strategy. Even if you go back into cars, right? There's always been essentially applications or legal frameworks that make it cheaper to purchase local. And I think it's always been the view that U.S. technology is the most advanced in the world. And I think we can still argue that's the case. But what we're seeing is the rest of the world catching up, not just because, again, people are better trained, is because the technology is better today. So you can build your own applications in those scenarios. I also think that if you think about AI, it's almost a matter of national security, right? Like you want to be able to ultimately control what exactly happens within your specific region as it relates to AI applications. There's going to be local rules. There's going to be local laws. There's going to be use cases that are military, use cases that are government, use cases that are private. And I think there's a big question right now. Should you be solely reliant on a third-party country providing that particular type of software? It's a question that has to be asked. And I think what we're seeing now is organizations have to take that into consideration. So if you're the biggest company within your specific region and you're thinking about your AI strategy over the course of a decade, right? So we're not talking about 6 months, a year, 2 years, over the course of a decade. You have to start thinking about sovereignty of data. And if you think a lot of the cases now, the solution was always, okay, great, we put walls around the data doesn't leave the country, it doesn't leave the region. But I think the additional question that's being asked is, where is the company HQ'd? And that's a little bit of a different question than data sovereignty. So I think it's ultimately important that we just acknowledge that AI, we haven't figured it all out yet. We just haven't. It's still new. And so one of the big questions, especially that when you take into consideration how Templafy approaches it, we're assuming we're going to be in a world with a patchwork of laws, rules, and regulations. And even within the US, within states, they have their own rules, laws, and regulations around AI. We still don't have a national framework. So if you kind of spread that out, now start thinking about a company that operates in 100 countries, you might be faced with regulations that are completely unpredictable. So for us, what we've done is we've made a deliberate choice to say, great, our software will work with any underlying AI, because I think for us, like we don't want to be in a scenario where we're trapped and solely reliant on a single provider, nor the organizations that we're servicing. So when we think about US-based tech dominance, it's going to get challenged, and it's being challenged all over the world by a lot of regions, and there's a lot of smart people everywhere, right? And so it's a scenario where I see a world where you're going to have to adjust, you're going to have to be multi-model, and if you're selling applications that touch hundreds of thousands, millions of users, you're going to have to take those key components into consideration.
I think it's really interesting you bring up that point about when we're talking about these international platforms, these international models. What do we actually mean by that? And this gets into the definition of sovereignty, and I wonder if we can dig down a bit deeper into it, because I think you in our discussion before, you mentioned a senior official that said they wouldn't use a solution relying on a US-based LLM, but in a cloud-native world, I guess that definition is getting a little slippery now. Are buyers concerned strictly with where the company HQ is, where the model weights reside, where data is processed? How deep does this scrutiny go during procurement? Are they auditing your entire supply chain for US dependencies?
That's a fantastic question. And I think previously it was about data sovereignty, right? It was about, where does data reside? Where are the operations happening? Who are you even contracting with? Are you contracting with a local entity? I think recently, I would say the last 6 months, the HQ question has been creeping in. So it's even though you have data sovereignty, even though there's essentially control of workflows, we're starting to get the question of, do we want to reasonably rely on a US company when there's a possibility that whether it's local rules, laws, or regs might ultimately impact how that model is trained or is operating? And so I think it's a fantastic question where in the cloud native universe, it was about sovereignty. I think recently the big change for, whatever apparent reason is that countries are starting to ask about, all right, where's the HQ? What kind of relationship can we have with headquarters? Can we predict what that organization is going to do in the long run? And it's, again, as I said a little bit earlier, it's the first time that organizations are asking the HQ question deeply. And part of the reason for that is that what we're seeing with model performance, right? And it ties into a performance question. Organizations are going to do what's best for them. Governments are going to do what's best for them. And if that's buying from a third party country provider, they do that. But I think what we're seeing is that for the majority of enterprise use cases today, the performance is close. It's very close. And what we're seeing is it's the software that provides the context to the models that actually results in great results. And so here's what I mean. And I can talk about us, right? Part of what we provide is the infrastructure that allows a model to provide a good result. So if you take a proposal, for example, or you take a pitch deck, there's a lot of mandatory requirements. You have brand, you have look and feel, you have content, you have data accuracy. And let's say you were to just put a prompt to essentially one of the large scale models, you're not going to get that quality of an output. And so it's the software layer that does that. So if you kind of zoom out a bit and think about it, from a performance perspective, if the models are pretty close, right? Again, between OpenAI, Anthropic, Gemini, DeepSeek, Mistral, Cohere, it feels very similar. It really does. You're for 99% of use cases, it is. So what becomes important? The software layer. Now, what that means is that as a procurement person, as a government entity, you now actually have a choice. And I think previously, maybe you didn't have a choice as to, okay, what's the best software where clearly it was out of the bay. Fantastic, right? That was the obvious choice. I think what you're seeing now, it's not the obvious choice because, again, you can leverage AI to essentially create the application layer more efficiently, okay, with fewer people that are trained, okay, check. So you don't need that 10x engineer anymore, right? You have enough decent engineers, you can build something really good. The model performances are getting close. Guess what? Once you've trained on all of the data available in the universe, guess what? At some point, and I'm being exaggerative, I'm saying if you train on everything online and all of you have done the same thing, at some point you start hitting a cap, right? Then it becomes about the application. Well, because of that, if I'm a CEO, I have a relationship with essentially the local government, or I am the government, I get to ask a fantastic question. Do we support our own economy? Do we support our own engineers? Do we push that agenda? And for companies like us, we're like, fantastic. We will connect to whatever it is that we need to connect to. So I think that's really what's happening is that we're playing a different game than in the cloud era, in the classic SaaS era, and that there's more options available. And it allows for procurement, for CEOs, for local government, for whomever to make a choice that they want to operate within the framework of their own region.
And I think that leads us nicely to our final question before I let you go, Jean-Marc. And I think that was the catalyst for certainly the conversation today, which was the French government replacing Teams and Zoom with their own sovereign inbuilt collaboration platform, which could be a massive signal for exactly the type of digital sovereignty conversations that we're having right now. However, many US tech giants still operate with a sense of inevitability. There is this feeling of almost a monopoly for set of these titans, Microsoft in particular, where they're assuming their ecosystems are too sticky to be ripped out. Based on the kind of deals you're seeing today, is that too big to fail starting to evaporate? If a major enterprise CIO ignores this sovereignty shift today, What does the infrastructure look like in 5 years? Obsolete or even illegal?
I would say this, that it's a scenario where governments get to ask the question, right? And are there great options available? Are we too deep into some of the larger tech companies where you can't necessarily pull out, right? Like it's not about too big to fail. And again, I won't, I think monopoly is a legal term that, I'll stay away from of whether it is or it isn't. What I'll simply say is that there's more options available than there ever has been, right? And that's for essentially every single use case. And the key thing is that you can't let a dependency impact your ability to perform, right? If you're an organization, you have to be prepared to shifts in the law. You have to be prepared for requirements of your local government. You have to be prepared to shift. And if we go back to what I was talking about earlier, the question is being asked. And what's interesting is that you have companies today that can raise their hand and say, yes, we can perform as well, if not better in some cases, than the original, let's say, tech giants. And so what you're going to see, I believe, in the next 5 years is that's going to come under pressure. Things that were considered locks, like, hey, we use, whomever for our cloud computing. Someone's going to deliver a service that can be fully local that challenges that. And so it's a scenario where, especially if you're one of the tech giants, you can't stop innovating. You can't stop being better, because the argument that you're the only game in town and that it would be very difficult to transition, that bar has been lowered, right? We've seen organizations, at first you see, okay, great, this is an open AI shop. And all of a sudden, you hear a big news announcement that same organization had signed a large agreement with Anthropic. Or you see that when you're using Azure, you can essentially connect to dozens and hundreds of different models. I think everyone's acknowledging that there are more options and that you don't want to create a dependency. And so it's a conversation I've had with CIOs that they're like, do we want to be dependent on an organization that is 10 years old and was only publicly known for 4 or 5 years? I mean, some of the AI giants are 3-4 years old. And so, and some of these companies that are buying AI or governments are hundreds of years old. So you got to kind of ask the question of, am I building a infrastructure that won't last the test of time? And am I putting myself in a situation where I can't negotiate, right? Because there are organizations, if you want to hear something interesting, that, very early on, they went with AWS, right? Okay, great. Well, what happens over time is that you're like, if your infrastructure only depends on one cloud provider, that creates negotiation risks, right? So they went ahead, okay, great, let's add some Azure, let's add some Google. Because organizations for any type of supply chain, I mean, this is classic supply chain, right? Just because, again, 10 years, 15 years ago, there was one provider, doesn't mean that you create this risk within your supply chain. And so while I was over at Accenture, again, I was working in the procurement strategy side of the business. It's just classic, right? You cannot put yourself in a position where you're completely beholden to a single provider ever. And ironically, or not ironically, those providers were US, right? So the big question is, outside of cloud, especially within the application layer, where I think you're going to find more variability, such as this example with France, right? It's a question that's going to be asked. And there's also a supply chain risk that organizations are making sure that they're able to address. And that's why we at Templafy, we're like, great, we can automate with precision, regardless of what you choose, when it comes to your document creation with Templafy document agents. And, I got to put in a plug for us, because I think we've seen it from the beginning. We're like, every 6 months, not even every 6 months, every 3 or 4 weeks, there's someone new on the leaderboard of who provides the best AI. And our prediction is that's going to continue to occur, and it's going to continue to occur globally, which means that you just have to be ready to address it. I think the key thing for organizations to think about is you don't want to lose agility and you don't want to lose market access because you put yourself in a position to be completely reliant on a single provider.
Perfect. I think there's a really salient note in which to end today's conversation. Agility and market access as the priorities. Unfortunately, that is the end of our conversation, but it has been a terrific session. So a massive thank you to Jean-Marc for being here.
Thank you very much. I appreciate this time and great speaking with you.
Absolutely. And if you enjoyed this video, please give us a like and share on socials, and we'll see you next time. I've been Kieran Devlin. Thanks for watching.